Well, I'll say we'll take it away, Christy. Thanks very much for being here. And you can introduce yourself and maybe give us the context of your presentation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diane, and thanks to Glenn for inviting me. I'll just say the context was that I think it was a few years back, and I actually I didn't go back and check what year, but there was the Bruno meeting, and Glenn said that that was a great meeting, and what he wanted me to do was just really give an update from then. So I actually have talked to the NFU group a couple of times, but the Bruno meeting was the first time that I was invited to speak to this group, and I was really excited at that time to be actually talking as an environmental scientist working at the University of Saskatchewan and conducting research. I was really excited to reach out and talk to producers who could take the information and really apply it in their everyday life. So I'm going to be talking about pesticide threats to biodiversity and to wetland health with a focus on the prairie region. And so I'm mostly going to talk about kind of those update on the problems, the science that we've been working on, as well as touch a little bit on our progress towards working towards solutions. Now, I know Darren really gave a superb talk that really honed in some of those policies and practices that are really necessary to move the dial. And I think maybe this research and this presentation will hopefully kind of mesh really well with Darren's earlier presentation. So I'll get started. Okay, so we're going to try something. Hopefully this works. Tim's going to help me out. We're going to try and do something a little bit interactive here. So to get you thinking, here's our first poll. So you should have the ability to poll now. This is a question: which region uses the most pesticides in Canada? So everybody should be able to see this, and you just want to enter A for BC, B for prairies, C for Ontario, Quebec, and D for Atlantic Canada. And I am seeing some responses come in, so it looks like it's working, Tim.
Unfortunately, people on the phone can't vote.
If you can't do this by phone, then no problem. Just hold in your thought what you, which answer you think is correct, and we'll see how you did compared to the group that's polling online right now. Okay, and I'll just give it another 10 seconds here. All right, so the results here are showing a kind of a neck and neck tie. So about half of you thought that Ontario, Quebec uses the most pesticides. So that's C. 54% of you said that. And in second place, 46% thought that B, the prairies, used the most pesticides. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing the results for that and move back to the talk. So in fact, if you were the ones that answered B, prairies, you were correct. In fact, the prairies use 85% of Canada's pesticides. So across the whole nation, the prairies are using 85% of our chemical use. There are 94 different active ingredients that are on the market today, and we use here in the prairies about 40,000 metric tons every year. So by far, we are the largest pesticide user in Canada. And in fact, Saskatchewan is the highest pesticide user by province. Okay, here's the second one. We'll do another one. So this is, if you got that one wrong, don't worry, you have another chance to redeem yourself. This question is, what do you think is the most widely used pesticide in the prairies? Okay, this is an A, B, C, D, E question. 2, 4, D is A. B is prothioconazole. C is chlorpyrifos. D is glyphosate. And E is thiamethoxam. So the question is really, do you even know what all of those chemicals are? Can you say them? Hopefully you can say 2,4-D, that's a short one, but let's see what people answer. So which is the most widely used pesticide in the prairies? Okay, I think there's just a few more seconds left before the polling will stop. Perfect. And overwhelmingly, 87% of you said that it was D, glyphosate. All right, so let's see if you were correct. I think you are. Glyphosate actually is by far the largest use of chemicals. So it's a herbicide. We use almost 27,000 tons, which is 73% of the total herbicide use. And it's in the prairies. And in fact, herbicides as a group are our most commonly used pesticides. So herbicides make up about 95% of the chemical use or pesticide use in the prairies and indeed across Canada. And glyphosate is the big hitter. Here's what it breaks down. So for those of you interested, pesticide use certainly is dominated by those herbicides, as I mentioned, glyphosate being one of the most commonly used chemicals on fields. There are, however, 55 different herbicides that are being used in the prairies. There's 27 different fungicides, and there's 12 different insecticides that are commonly applied to prairie crops. And this kind of statistics or whatever, or just we recently just published this, pesticide use for those of you who are not familiar is not widely known in Canada. It's not widely published. And in fact, we had to obtain this data through a proprietary source. And so it's based on a survey of about 1,800 farmers across the region. And so it's not actual pesticide use that's by sales. We don't collect that kind of information in Canada, and it's urgently needed. But what we do know here, you can sort of see the relative frequency of these chemicals, which is important information to figure out which ones are the problematic ones. Okay, here's the third one to kind of see how you're doing and see if you're all back and awake. So this is the third and last one for these questions. Which is currently the most controversial of the insecticides? So now I'm just talking about the insecticides due to its high use, persistence, and toxicity concerns to wildlife and to surface waters. So in Canada, and indeed in the prairies, which is currently the most controversial insecticide. So these on this list, they're all insecticides. DDT is A, B is lindane, C is permethrin, D is malathion, E is imidacloprid, and F is carbofuran. So these are all chemicals that are widely used to control insect pests. And let's see what you say is the most controversial. Great. So just another 10 seconds to kind of wrap up your answers. And again, we seem to have a close race here. All right, so most of you, about half of you said that it was D, malathion. I know it looks like we were short. We didn't have F on the list there, so I apologize, but that's okay. It wasn't carbofuran anyways. And then second place, people said 42% said it was imidacloprid. So kind of a tie between malathion and imidacloprid, and a few of you said lindane. Well, as it turns out, you are, the majority were not correct in this particular poll. Actually, the most commonly used or most controversial insecticide is imidacloprid. And imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid insecticide. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So as it turns out, on the far right graph is the insecticides, and the ones that are most commonly used in the prairies. Thiamethoxam is the number one. It's a neonicotinoid. Number two is chlorpyrifos, but number three is clothianidin, which is also a neonicotinoid. Number four is cyantriniloprol. That's one of the newer chemicals that are on the market to replace neonicotinoids. And number five on the list is imidacloprid in terms of use in the Canadian prairies. So really, out of the top five, three of them are neonicotinoids, so they're very widely used. And although insecticides only make up about 1% of the total pesticide use, by far their toxicity concerns for both wildlife as well as in aquatic environments, these are the most controversial and most worrying. In fact, for neonicotinoids, we estimate that we use about 216 tons of neonics in the prairies every year. You can see from this map, they're more or less following the canola belt, and we're using them across the region in fairly high concentrations. So this is data from 2012. We have no reason to believe that it's shifted or changed much since 2012, but may have actually increased. It was on an increasing trajectory. Now, one of the concerns that we have about insecticide use in general is that they do get into wetlands and that they can contaminate surface waters. This is a map that we just recently produced around where insecticides are being used most commonly. And I guess what you can just right out of the gate see is that Saskatchewan is a problematic province for its use of insecticides. So by far in the prairies, Saskatchewan is using the most insecticide products. And we also know that in terms of exposure to wetlands based on wetland density and based on rainfall patterns or moisture patterns, as well as use patterns, this region that's kind of overlapping the canola belt, I guess, is really high risk for wetland exposure to insecticides. And a lot of this risk is driven by the neonicotinoids and because of their high water solubility, high persistence. So they are, as well as high use. So neonics are harmful to a whole bunch of beneficial aquatic insects. Not all the things that are flying around are annoying and bad for you. Many of the non-biting midges, for example, are really important for a whole bunch of consumers. And neonics, as it turns out, they easily move into surface waters and they can affect these aquatic insects in terms of their larval development. And we've seen from various studies, both in my own lab, but also other research being done around the world, that neonics can decrease the amount of emergence of these insects coming out of these surface waters. They decrease the abundance of them. It reduces the overall biomass of insects, and it can also even change the timing of when those bugs come out of the water. In fact, it makes them come out faster or earlier than they should. And it also alters their sex ratios. So we see a sort of shift in the number of males to females, which can, again, alter population dynamics for breeding insects that are all timed very carefully to have these pulses. And as I said, a lot of insect consumers, like birds and other wildlife, depend on this resource. So it's really important that we don't disrupt this food web. Now, farmland birds are sort of an area of focus that I've been working on for several years, and neonics can also affect these farmland birds. And I'll talk about briefly these two different ways. So the first is the indirect effect. So you have these neonics and other chemicals that get into the surface water, affects the abundance and types of insects that are present in that water, and eventually that kind of changes the amount of food available for insectivorous birds like the barn swallow pictured here, that really heavily depends on these insect prey. You can also have direct effects, and this is kind of a bit more complex, but we typically think of big sprayers, which can spray areas, and actually birds may inhale some of that spray, or they may come in contact with their skin. Obviously, these are toxic chemicals that affect the nervous system. So, the reason that they're harmful to humans is the same reason why they're harmful to birds. And so we have to be pretty careful about that. Birds will also preferentially eat kind of squirming, dying insect prey. So things that have been recently sprayed can cause poisoning events for birds that consume that contaminated prey. And more recently, the emphasis has been on this consumption of treated seeds. So for the case of the neonics, as with many insecticide and fungicides that are out in the market today, they are no longer sprayed. They're actually planted as treated seeds. And those consumption of treated seeds can be particularly problematic for birds that are seed eaters, the granivores, like the red-winged blackbird and other seed-eating grassland birds. And as it turns out, some of those chemicals that I put in that poll, that survey that you just did, you'll recognize DDTs on there, malathion, imidacloprid, chlorpyrifos, and carbofuran. They aren't all the same toxicity. And many of us kind of think like DDT was the worst thing that was ever produced. And in fact, it was bad. There's no question it was bad, but the toxicity of DDT is much lower to birds than it is than something like the imidacloprid, the neonicotinoid imidacloprid. So you can see that the LD50 value, that's the lethal dose to kill half of a test population, is about 1,300 milligrams per kilogram for DDT. So you need a lot more DDT to kill half of them than you do for imidacloprid. You might only need about 35 milligrams per kilogram to kill a small songbird. So neonics are much more toxic than these previous compounds, although there are still many compounds that we use today that are widespread. Many of the organophosphates, for example, malathion, chlorpyrifos, diazinon, that are also highly toxic to birds. So we have to be very careful about their use, but many of those are not used in the same quantities that the neonicotinoids are used in. Sorry, I just have some arrows there. Now we know there's quite a bit of evidence that birds are being exposed to these treated neonicotinoid seeds. This was a study done just south of the border in prairie fields that look very similar to ours. And you can see that many of the problems are associated with spilling of treated seeds. This can happen in corners as the farm equipment banks around a corner, you might get some spilling. Most of it I don't think is on purpose, but I think it's just kind of getting jammed in the hopper, and these things spill, and then you have these small seed piles. And there has been plenty of evidence now of birds consuming these treated seeds from field surveys and trail cameras. And so these seed piles can rapidly disappear because of wildlife consuming them. And treated seeds that have also been found in the crop and gizzard of birds that are opened up. So when they open a dead bird that's found, then you can see that these seeds have a little bit of color to them. And if you test them chemically, you can determine that the cause of death would have been consumption of these poisonous seeds. And this is just for context. Here's some seed piles that my student Tyler took a picture of in Saskatchewan last year. These are enormous seed piles of treated seeds that were dumped or spilled or something next to a wetland, and obviously are problematic because they're being left out for birds and other wildlife to consume in fairly large quantities. Now, around the world, there's increasing evidence that neonics are a problem for birds. These are all studies that were done really just since 2017. So very recent research documenting evidence that birds are exposed to neonics. So people measuring neonics in various tissues of birds. In particular, I'll just point out the white-crowned sparrow here. We have detected 78% of the blood samples we took from birds in southern Ontario had neonicotinoids detectable in their blood when we captured them. And in tree swallows here in Saskatchewan, we found 100% of their blood samples had detectable concentrations of neonicotinoids. Now, tree swallows don't eat treated seeds, but they're obviously getting this through contaminated prey or water sources. But even species like hummingbirds on the far right seem to be exposed. So it's definitely a problem across a wide range of wildlife species. And this really is probably a product of the fact that they're just so widely used. The other kind of issue is that birds tend to use these fields in the spring when they're migrating, and actually they use them to stop and rest, sometimes to fuel, and they'll pick up the odd seeds if they're available. If they're, some of them are shallowly seeded, but also you have those seed piles. Now we've been doing some research to look at the exposure of songbirds that might consume these on migration and try to understand what might happen to them if they are consuming those treated seeds, or even indeed just small doses incidentally through the environment. It turns out that a white-crowned sparrow only weighs about 27 grams. So I showed you those massive seed piles. I could really do this as a poll, but looking at this kind of information about imidacloprid and the toxicity to a songbird like a white-crowned sparrow, you might wonder, well, how many seeds does it need to actually eat in order to be killed or have a toxic dose from these neonicotinoids? Well, it's not a lot. The data is that for corn seeds that are treated, it just needs to eat less than one. In fact, a tenth of a corn seed has enough chemical on it to kill a 27 grams songbird. Sunflower seeds is less than 3. Cereals, they need to eat about 34. And canola seeds, they need to eat about 37 of them to get this toxic dose. And just for reference, a white-crowned sparrow like this eats about 230 equivalent wheat kernels or 2,300 equivalent canola seeds per day. So it's absolutely nothing for them to eat 30 or 40 seeds that they might find. And when we've done now research on what actually happens to them, we can expose them experimentally in a captive setting to these chemicals. And we find that when we expose them to imidacloprid, just a tiny dose that predicted to not cause lethality, we're not trying to cause death, but we give them a fraction of the dose that would cause death, 10 or 25% of the lethal dose. We actually find that if we give that to them for 3 days, they rapidly lose their body mass. So the black line at the top is the controls. They more or less stay the same body weight, but the darker blue line is birds after 3 days. You can see that line is going straight down, and for the high dose group, that which is getting about a tiny amount of neonics, they also see this huge mass loss. And the amounts are 17% or 25% of their body mass in just 3 days. So they can lose up to a quarter of their body weight in 3 days. And this is the equivalent of eating only about a third of a treated corn seed per day, or about 3 or 4 canola seeds per day. We weren't feeding them seeds, we were giving them the pure chemical, but if a bird was flying around and found a field, even if they incidentally picked up a treated seed or two, they would likely exhibit these effects. And we know that from further work that we went on to do that free-living birds are also, they are exposed to imidacloprid. So we wanted to study what actually happens to them in the wild. So we did this same type of study that we did in a captive setting, but this time we did it in the field. We actually did this in southern Ontario, where there were facilities and radio tracking towers that could assist us with this study. And we put a little radio tag on the back of the bird. So the third image from the right is a picture of a white-crowned sparrow that we captured. We weigh the bird when we start. We put it in a little machine that measures its body fat and mass and lean mass. And we attach this little radio transmitter to its back. So you can see a long antenna sticking out from its back. And we give them this dose of imidacloprid. We hold them for just 6 hours, and then we release them so that they can fly around and tell us what happens when they're in the wild, using something called the MODIS wildlife tracking system, which is a series of towers. These are all yellow dots that you can see on the map. And those yellow dots are all these towers, receiver towers, that when the bird flies by them, the tower will detect that signal and tell us or automatically log that that bird was there. So really powerful system. So here's what we found, very similar to that captive experiment. The birds rapidly lost mass in just 6 hours. So the previous study was 3 days, but even in 6 hours, they didn't lose lean mass, but they did lose overall body mass. So that's 6% reduction in body mass, 17% reduction in body fat, and a 70% reduction in food intake. So they essentially become sort of anorexic. They stop eating, they lose body fat and overall body mass very, very rapidly. After we released them, it actually caused a significant delay in their migration. So these birds were just stopping there to refuel. Usually they only stop for sort of a few days, but in the case where birds were dosed with the imidacloprid, we found that they delayed their migration by up to 3.5 days longer than the control. So the control birds were treated exactly the same way, held in captivity, but only given sort of corn oil instead of the imidacloprid with the corn oil. And as it turns out, they spend an extra 3.5 days to recuperate their body mass, recover from the pesticide exposure. And that means that their migration departure is delayed significantly. And we know this is a problem for birds because if they arrive late on the breeding grounds up north, then they have a lower chance of reproducing, and that can have population consequences because they'll have fewer young in their lifetime, and the population is dependent on these birds having a productive season. Okay, so having said all of that, neonics are registered for use in Canada. They are registered through the Health Canada's PMRA registration process. They were first registered in about 2003. There's some slight, I say that about because there are different neonics on the market, and some of them were registered just before others, but essentially around about 2003 when they were all registered. And they've been on the market now for the past 20 years or so. So do you think, or do you trust Health Canada's PMRA registration process to ensure that all pesticides on the market are safe for the environment? Let's say A is yes, B is no, and C you're unsure. Maybe I could say that, you know, some people might be confused about after they hear this talk, they might have a different answer than they did before. So it'd be very interesting if I polled you before and after the talk. Okay, just another 10 seconds here to let you answer. For those people on the phone, just think about your answer and we can compare. All right. So most of you said B, you're not trusting the Health Canada's PMRA registration process. And perhaps, as I said, this might be a reflection of the fact that I've just given you this kind of information that says really, you know, these chemicals we're using now, which are registered and considered safe, are on the market, but we have this kind of ongoing challenge that they are problematic for birds and for aquatic environments. It turns out that one of the problems we have is that registered, the safety of registered pesticides to birds and other wildlife is really kind of hinging on the fact that the process is kind of flawed. So it's not that they're not doing the work and that Health Canada is willy-nilly registering pesticides. It's the fact that we have almost 9,000 different registered products in Canada. So it's an enormous number. That number just keeps growing. About every 15 years, not about, at 15 years, all of them, each chemical needs to go through a reevaluation process to ensure that it's safe. So most of these chemicals, they cannot keep up with that re-registration or reevaluation process just because there's too many of them. Ones that are highly complex or controversial take up an enormous amount of time, and the neonics are a classic example of that, where these chemicals are receiving a lot of controversy, there's a lot of data and a lot of science, and as a result, it clogs up the system. So they cannot reevaluate them for their health and safety. For the case of birds, pesticides are actually only typically tested on 1 to 3 bird species. For aquatic invertebrates, it might be something like 3 or 4. And I've showed in other talks the fact that often the selection of which species you use can greatly influence the outcome of the registration process. So this is something on the right called a species sensitivity distribution. As it turns out, there's only 9 species here of birds that have been tested for the safety of neonicotinoids. And there's quite a range in sensitivity, because if you look on the x-axis, it's actually in kind of log scale, which means that from the left to the right, the least sensitive to the most sensitive is kind of like 1,000 times different. So, you know, the quail is relatively insensitive, the zebrafinch or most songbirds are relatively sensitive, but there's kind of a big range there. And we're only testing a tiny number of species relative to what the world has, you know, an estimated 10,000 bird species in the world. And even Canada and the US has more than 800 species. So are we really protecting all the birds and all the wildlife using a system that only tests 1 species that might by chance be less sensitive to the chemical? And then also we're looking at asking the scientists within Health Canada to review such an enormous number of chemicals. So Health Canada now is reconsidering the registration of imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamethoxam, the neonicotinoids, mostly due to environmental concerns, not really due to human health concerns. There are regulatory reviews in progress related to pollinators. There's a squash bee special review going on. There's an aquatic invertebrate special review for both clothianidin and thiamethoxam, but also for imidacloprid. And there's this cyclical reevaluation happening, which is the 15-year reevaluation for imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, and clothianidin. And interestingly, that cyclical reevaluation started in 2016, and here we are in 2020, and they haven't figured out or made a final decision on those chemicals. So you can see that the process is really, really slow. and it's cumbersome. And for these really complex chemicals and ones that are highly controversial, the chance of making an actual, producing the reports and then making a decision is really burdened by the process. And really can be quite harmful to the environment for many years beyond the time span it's taken us to figure out that these things are problematic. So for example, neonics were proposed to be banned in 2016, and now we're in 2020 and we still don't have a final decision. I have heard that it's supposed to be decided by fall 2020, but I have also heard that same thing a couple of times now already in past years. So it keeps getting delayed. If you're looking for more information, I put the link there. And meanwhile, while we delay these kind of bans, we also know that there's this ongoing concern of the worldwide decline of insects and other invertebrates. A recent review in 2019 came out that said 40% of insect species are now threatened worldwide with extinction. So, you know, the more we're using these toxic insecticides and the longer that we delay this process of getting rid of the ones that are most problematic, we also are putting our food systems at risk. We're putting biodiversity at risk. And this is happening not only here in Canada and North America, but around the world. So I'll just briefly touch on what we can do now. Darren did a great job of kind of highlighting some of the things and really the principles that I fully support. But I think I'll just touch on a few things that we're thinking about in my own research about essentially solutions-based on-farm research. We're trying to not only just study the problem, the things that are, you know, the doom and gloom story. We're also trying to figure out how do we do this better and can we engage farmers into the conversation and into the research to be more proactive. So for example, we have a study which is looking at how can we reduce pesticide and nutrient contamination of wetlands by restoring or increasing perennial buffers. So this is in partnership with Alice Canada and Ducks Unlimited, working on private farmland where there has been perennial grasses and forages planted in and around wetlands to try and restore the health of those systems. And we're trying to study how to do that better, right? So how big do these need to be? What are the benefits to aquatic invertebrates and to water quality after implementing those kind of practices, which are considered to be best management practices, but we don't have a lot of data that support how good they are. So we're trying to figure that out. We have some evidence that this works, you know, that planting vegetative buffers is good for reducing neonic contamination. An earlier study that my past PhD student did, Anson Main, he looked at vegetative buffers with you know, wetlands that just naturally had buffers and ones that didn't. And he found the ones that didn't have the buffer tended to have spikes in neonic concentrations after rainfall events compared to the ones that had a natural buffer. So we think that having a buffer in place is probably a really good thing and can reduce the amount of pesticides getting into the water, which is good for protecting them. The second study we're doing is adding field level perennial diversity to improve overall insect and bird biodiversity, but also we're looking at the effects on yields and profitability in these systems. So maybe some of you have some marginal areas, some areas that are saline or just don't grow a crop very well, areas around wetlands. And so we're asking producers to kind of identify 3 of their fields that they are willing to take some crop out of production, either next to wetlands or in some marginal or saline area. And they replace between 10 and 25% of the cropland in those targeted areas with diverse perennial grasses, so a kind of forage mix. And we asked them to do it on 3 different fields, and then we monitor that against 3 of their control fields, ones that they're just doing business as usual. to see what the impacts are on the water quality, on the biodiversity, etc. So that's exciting new work that we have in place. And there's some evidence that this kind of works, that in other places in the world, like Iowa State has been doing some interesting research similar to this in corn, soybean production systems, where they added perennial prairie strips into these highly simplified systems. And they found some real strong benefits from integrating just 10% of the, or changing 10% of the cropland into these kind of prairie perennial strips. And they found there was an increase in insect taxa, pollinator abundance, native bird abundance. There was also soil retention, and there was phosphorus retention. So there's a huge amount of benefits. And interestingly, they also saw no net loss of profitability in these systems. So it looks like you can take some farmland out of production and get more bang for your buck by using biodiversity to promote ecosystem services that benefit the producer as well as the environment. And then the third one, the last one I'll just talk about, is something we haven't started yet, but we're trying to drum up some interest. And that's about how we can reduce pest pressure and pesticide use to protect birds on farms while still improving crop production. So obviously the left picture of a canola monoculture is kind of the most common practice in Saskatchewan. And here on the right, we're looking at working with farmers who are innovating using intercropping or other methods to see if these actually do have benefits in reducing pesticide exposure to birds, as well as, again, looking at the yields and the production profitability for farmers, looking for those win-wins. And so we're trying to see whether that kind of this idea is certainly got promise in the literature. It suggests that where you have more diversity of crops, more diverse rotations, where you use different plant species, either in a cover crop or in an intercrop, or even where you introduce livestock into these systems, that any kind of diversity is really good for the whole system. And it can promote a lot of benefits to the crop and to the soil health, but also you can see benefits, hopefully, to reducing your chemical use or your need for pesticides, which ultimately is what we're looking for birds, for example, to be protected. So ideally, if we can find a solution that needs less chemical, that would be ideal. All right, so I'll just put a plug out there that if people are interested in participating in the research, this is ongoing. We are doing a little bit of it still here in COVID year, but we also are forecasting out for 2021 and interested in finding you and your farms to participate in different research projects. So I'm open to that, but also if people have any comments or thoughts after the talk today, then I'm also open to hearing from you. And here's my contact details, and also that of my kind of project manager, April, who's running some of the projects that I talked about. So thanks.
Okay, Diane here. Thank you very much, Christy. I'm going to open it up first to Glenn because he didn't get a chance to introduce you, and he may have had some points he wanted to make. So,
sure.
Glenn, are you there?
Yeah, I'm back, and I apologize. I hit *6 to unmute at the beginning of your presentation, and that was just enough power to make my phone die. So I had to go find another one and came back into the conversation.
Joys of online stuff, right?
Oh, yes. I didn't have a lot of questions for you. I just was going to do a short introduction, and I missed it completely. Were you introduced at all?
Well, I introduced myself, Glenn, but yeah, no problem. Don't worry about it. It's okay. So, but if there's something you wanted to add, I'm okay with that. But I think the people, I've talked to a lot of the people on the call. I recognize a lot of names as well. So.
Yeah, well, I was just going to run over your bona fides, which I imagine you've done already, and mention that you're publishing at least 2 papers a year on various topics, including ag pesticide use, wetland exposure, neonics, bird migration, and mitigation with bird collision with wind energy developments. So that's something that I don't think you talked on in this bit, but.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, stay busy. Thank you very much, though, Glenn, for the plug.
Okay, so thanks, Glenn. Sorry you didn't get the chance to introduce Christy, but she introduced herself, which is great too. So we'll do the same as we did for Darren, that it's a Q&A, and also people may have contributions they want to make, but we ask you to limit your time speaking to 2 minutes or less so that we can hear from a diversity of people. So if you can raise your hand either on the computer or through your phone with *9, that would be great, or some other way of indication. And I'll ask Tim to keep track of who's in the lineup. And Tim, do you have someone who might be first?
First is Al Burchard.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Al.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have 2 really quick questions. The first one is, when they're assessing the efficacy and the dangers behind insecticide, pesticide use, are they using a model that assesses what's safe, or are they using a model that is along the lines of the acceptable risk level? And my second question is, you mentioned a few of the problems and delay in getting insecticides or pesticides evaluated. I'm wondering what effect the tremendous lobbying effort of the chemical industry has on that process. Thank you.
Great questions. Thanks, Al. Your first one was about how they are, like what process they're using to determine whether, a chemical can be registered. And actually you raised you used 2 words. One is safe and the other is risk. And they are not equivalent. So safe would mean that, I kind of liken this to actually, here in COVID times, is it absolutely safe for all children to go back to school? No. There is a possibility that something could happen. And so there is always a risk. And so actually our government and our legislation uses a risk-based approach. So it's not about absolute safety. It's about risk, which is essentially using exposure. So how likely is it that something's going to be exposed to this chemical, but also how toxic is it if they are exposed? So how bad would it be? And so the process is to use acceptable risk and to weigh that to some extent based on the plant protection goals, right? So we need pesticides to grow food, and it is a tool, but they are looking at whether or not the risk outweighs the benefits, because really all pesticides are poisons, right? So there is no absolute safe, and so it is really looking at an acceptable risk level. Now, your second question was about the lobbying, and absolutely. Part of the delay, or a major part of the delay, has been the chemical companies lobbying, but also tremendous effort to generate their own science, to refute the science that's out there and conducted by myself and other scientists around the world, actually. So they produce science. A lot of it is garbage, in my opinion, but they are still producing it, and it still gets reviewed alongside all of the other science. And so by doing that, for example, collecting water samples across the prairies or in other regions to say that the water concentrations are below levels that are known to cause harm, they are presenting a weight of evidence like of their own collected data that to try and sway the government to say that there is not likely to be a high enough risk. Of course, what water samples you collect, like where you collect them, which fields, and all those other things, they're important. And in many cases, they are using methods that would not be scientifically valid and would not hold up in publications, but are still put up against the same science that is peer reviewed. So it is a problem, and the government is receiving a lot of pressure from industry groups for sure.
Okay, thank you. Tim, do you have another question from someone?
Either Nettie, Jim, or Martha.
It's Nettie. Thanks for a brilliant talk. This is so fascinating. We're organic, and we have the luxury really of having a lot of contiguous land. So we have definitely noticed an increase in songbirds and variety of songbirds on our farm over the last few decades. But what I wanted to ask was, and it's hooked to something that Darren said about the increased use of chemicals, particularly in Saskatchewan. And I'm sadly not surprised by that data. But as it's hooked to the productivity, and you said something, and you had one chart here towards the end of your talk about intercropping actually being more diversity, offering more diversity, but actually not a decline in productivity. And I'm just wondering whether there's good data on just how much productivity in this province is actually hooked to the increased use of chemicals, and whether that whole complex of productivity and export orientation could be challenged just on the prudential grounds that it's actually not more productive than an agroecological system. Thanks.
Super question, Nettie. So the short answer is we don't have good data on that productivity linked to chemical use. So, does adding this amount of chemicals or having this level, is this level of chemical use necessary to maintain production at the current level? And we don't have data for that. I can tell you in France, there has been studies done that have showed that essentially they could reduce chemical use by 70% and have no net loss of production. So to what extent that translates here, I don't know, but that would be something that we really need to do, right? Like, how low can you go, I think is really the question. And instead, what we're sort of leaning towards is how much more can we use without being told not to? And I think that that's the wrong way to go. I do agree with you that we need to be pushing producers to use less and less and less and test it, right? Rather than using the chemicals as an insurance policy or as a, prophylactic or more is better, right? You have a headache, you take one pill, maybe two is better, right? I mean, that's actually not correct. It's not right, but we all sort of suffer sometimes from that kind of mentality, and I think we need the science to back that up. But I agree with you. That's a huge priority. There is still, though, encouraging data about the intercropping for people who are doing it that actually increases yields and decreases the amount of pesticide needed to grow the crops, as well as fertilizers and other chemicals that are problematic. So I think we need to innovate, and farmers are really good at that. You guys are great at that. So I think we need to innovate to look at ways of how we can produce using less chemical and reap the benefits for biodiversity, but also the economic benefits, which are substantial.
Okay, thank you for the question and also the answer. Tim, next speaker.
Katie, if your phone battery is willing, and ask.
I see.
I can read it out if not. Your question is if there are any studies
You have to
regarding...
unmute Katie, or you'll have to take off your mask. Maybe it's both. No, kidding.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It might have been the mask. I'm borrowing internet in the city here, and someone high risk came in the room, so I'm trying to be careful. But I picked an NFU colored mask.
I like it. I like it.
Thank you. So I'm calling in, of course, from Eastern Ontario. I farm in the Ottawa Valley. So I know that your research is, of course, where you get the most bang for the buck, where the most herbicides and insecticides are used. But is there studies going on in other parts of the country about this? And do you have any insight on, what the results are? Is the data pretty consistent across the board?
Well, there is research certainly on some of the farming practices and pesticide use, and my research group is studying pesticide use across Canada. So we've been trying to actually get that data in a widely available format to publish it, because the federal government is not publishing this information and not making it available. So we are doing that across Canada for all the major agricultural regions. In terms of the bird work or biodiversity work, there is certainly work on insects and pollinators that's very good across the country, including in Ontario. But in terms of the bird work, there's less. So far, there's been very little research, and my group has really been the only one that I'm aware of doing any kind of work on birds and pesticides in the country. So I think there's still lots to do, and we are very interested in understanding the differences in these agricultural systems between the East and the West. Obviously, they're not the same. Nobody who comes from either or has seen a prairie field is going to compare that to one in Ontario, Southern Ontario or Quebec. And nor does the chemical use patterns mirror each other. So absolutely necessary to be looking at this in a region-specific way, right? They all have their own unique context, and I think that kind of work is urgently needed. So thanks for your comment, though.
Great. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Tim, is there another question?
John Gordon. Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, John.
Thanks. That was a great presentation. My municipality, I'm a rural municipal councillor, and we've contributed every year. We contribute a fair bit of money from the municipality to the Southeast Research Farm, and I noticed it turned up today in part of your presentation. I saw it come on the screen. Yeah. And they're doing quite a bit of work on intercropping, and I would really encourage anyone who is a councillor on the municipality or knows councillors on municipalities to encourage them to kick in some support for that group. And it's nearby us, so I guess that's why we got into it, but we're continuing support, and we will be continuing support. Do you have any comments on what they're doing? I haven't been down there, but I'm really interested in keeping up that support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're doing fantastic things. It's Lana Shaw, I believe, is leading that charge there, and they're experimenting. Right? They're experimenting with different crops, combinations. They're experimenting with, how, again, the sort of thinking that Nettie was talking about how little chemical can we get away with. But they're also seeing some tremendous promise in terms of the production yields going, greater than 100%. So if you were to grow the two crops separately, you can get yield X, but if you grow them together, you can increase that to 120 or 130% of what you would if you were growing them separately. So growing them together can be a huge benefit to the producer if they can overcome the sort of you know, logistical barriers around separating the crop and timing the crop correctly. But all of these things are being worked out in an experimental way. And what we really need to do is mainstream it, right? So make that more mainstream to kind of encourage producers to go out and try it. And to reach out to that group, the South End Research Group, who are doing some of this really great work, because there is a lot of tools and resources available. And the piece that they're really interested in is, you know, whether or not this does indeed have environmental benefits. They're quite confident now that it has benefits to the production system, to their yields and to their bottom line in terms of the economics, but they have less understanding of whether it's beneficial to biodiversity, to, you know, intuitively we think it does, but we need a bit more data to support that. And I mean, ultimately, you know, in my perfect world, my vision is that, you know, the government would incentivize these kind of practices and provide, and not be relying so much on, you know, organizations, NGOs to be incentivizing these practices, but rather, you know, through both tax credits, but also through actual cash payments, that we should be incentivizing producers to do these good practices, because not only is it beneficial to them, but it's beneficial to all of, you know, to birds and biodiversity and ecosystem services that, you know, the public is benefiting from. So I think we need more information to actually figure out what that value is, so that we can correctly give a price tag to it.
Okay, thank you, Christy. I'm conscious that the clock is coming close to 7, and Tim, is there anyone else in the line for a question?
No one else that I see.
Well, I'll give maybe one more person a chance to push the button to ask a question if they wish to. But also I want to ask Glenn and perhaps Mara if there are any other officials of the NFU have something that they want to say before we close today, so to make sure we have time for that.
So there's one hand from Ed now.
Okay, so Ed will be our last question, and then I'll turn it back to Mara or Glenn to conclude today. So Ed, are you there to go ahead?
Just need to unmute, Ed, if you're talking.
Tim,
you're on the phone, Ed. You might need to dial *6 to unmute.
Yes, Christy, when you spoke at Humboldt, there was an organic farmer there. I can't remember his name, but he had farmed organically for quite a few years, and he was suggesting you sample the water holes on his land, which should not have the chemical load into it because they just run off his land. Did you do anything about that?
I'm trying to remember, Ed. We do have field sites in Humboldt area, but I'm not sure which specific field you're referring to.
Yeah, well, I just remember that he suggested you sample on his land because he said, but I don't remember exactly where he's from, down south of Saskatchewan somewhere.
Yeah, we've been doing water sampling of wetlands across the whole prairie region in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and we do have a concentration around Humboldt area. And those are certainly kind of a hotspot area where we do see a lot of contamination of wetlands, primarily because it's a very wet area, but it also is an area with high use as well. So I'm not sure if we specifically sampled that one spot, but again, we are sampling across the big region, and we're interested in patterns that, you know, not just one specific producer, and we sort of amalgamate all that data, of course. So it's never a, you're a bad guy and you're a good guy. we don't pick and choose quite like that, but we're we are looking at sort of the surrounding land use and looking at a diversity of different crops when we are sampling. So, but we do have an area around Humboldt that we are sampling in.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank